To our second keynote speaker, we are delighted to have Maria Doa from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Maria Doa is also recently joining the OECD Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials, also as chair, not only from the United States delegation, but also for the testing program, together with Kirsten Rasmussen from the JRC. She will guide us probably through the Toxic Substances Control Act. Before a new chemical is commercialized in the manufacturer or importer, it must submit a new chemical notification to the United States EPA. So, thank you for coming, and we enjoy.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about how we review nanoscale materials in the United States. There's no overarching legislation that covers nanoscale materials in the United States. Nanoscale materials are managed under existing statutes for chemicals, which covers industrial, commercial, and many consumer uses of chemicals. There's separate legislation for pesticides and for food and drugs. I will be talking about the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is the legislation that covers chemicals. And there are a number of parts of this law, which is commonly known as TSCA, like the opera. And one of the things that it covers are new chemicals before they are commercialized, before they're put on the market. I'll focus on that today because this is where we've done the most work in the United States. But it also covers existing chemicals, new uses of the chemicals, the collection of information on chemicals that are already on the market, toxicity and exposure testing, and it provides us with the ability to impose limits and other controls on things that are already on the market. The U.S. right now is developing regulations on nanoscale materials that are already on the market and prospective uses of nanoscale materials that are based on bulk materials. We have this dichotomy in the U.S. between new and existing. And I should note at this point, because definitions are very important for the regulations we're developing, we will be including a definition of nanoscale material. So, in the U.S., the paradigm is different than it is here in Europe. And we review new chemicals before they're commercialized, and there must be a notification submitted to the Environmental Protection Agencies for things that are not already on our inventory. That is, they're not already commercialized and existing. It's not a registration program. It's a notification program that provides for review. After the review is complete, it's placed on the inventory, often with limitations, but folks can make it once it's on the inventory. And just a brief minute, I just think this sort of background on how we review new chemicals is useful because it's the context under which we review new nanoscale materials. We have 90 regulatory days to review a substance. And at the end of that, we have to make a determination that the manufacturing, import, processing, use, disposal, that it may not present an unreasonable risk. So it's not that we do a risk assessment and then make a determination, yay or nay. The standard is not that high. We have to take all the information and make a determination that it won't cause this risk. The submitter is required to submit to EPA information on the chemical identity. They provide us with information on how the chemical is manufactured, often quite detailed. It includes information on any byproducts and impurities that are made, how much they're going to make or import, what are the uses, this is very important for the assessment, the amount that's going to be used, any exposure information, including worker exposure, which is an important consideration for us, how they're going to dispose of it, any existing test data, and I'll come back to this because this is a limitation for us, and pollution prevention data. So one of the things we look at is the information that we have sufficient for us to make a reasoned evaluation about the health, environmental effects, and in the absence of this information, will there be an unreasonable risk? Can we make this determination? So in assessing the chemicals, we generally look throughout the life cycle. We look at the toxicity, we look at exposure to workers, we try to do a site-specific assessment looking at releases, general population exposure, and consumer exposure. And this is, probably consumer exposure is where we're most limited. And this, of course, is an issue for nanoscale materials. Coming back to the issue of test data, the law requires that submitters only provide information that they have or that they have control of, and they would submit that to EPA. There's no data set that they have to do, no testing. So what EPA has done over time is we've developed a lot of predictive models, technical tools, professional judgment, and we've developed a lot of chemical categories that help us in terms of assessing whether the chemical will be a problem or not. For example, one example is we have a category of benzidine-based dyes. Benzidine is a known human bladder carcinogen, so we look at whether the information available to us would lead us to believe that the dye would degrade to generate benzidine. And we will use this with nanoscale materials. Now, under the Toxic Substance Control Act, because we're focusing on things that haven't been commercialized so far, and our universe really focuses on CNTs, fullerenes, modified fullerenes, quantum dots, some titania and silica derivatives. But as a general matter, under the New Chemicals Program, we don't get most of the metals and metal oxides. And so our assessment is based on the information we have from the submitter and the information that's in the literature on things that are fairly similar. And while for existing chemicals we're developing a definition of nanoscale materials, we don't have a regulatory definition for purposes of new chemicals because it doesn't matter. If it hasn't been commercialized yet, they need to send in a notification to EPA and we would review it. And we review nanoscale materials in a manner similarly to other chemicals. And there are things that are very unique, certainly about nanoscale materials, the size distribution, the morphology, but it's unique to nanomaterials, but there are things in other categories of chemicals where there are things that are extremely unique to them. PBTs are another category where there are a lot of things that are unique to them and we review them in a very specific way. But ultimately, what we need to determine is before this chemical is commercialized, do we think it will present an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment? When we do get a submission on a nanoscale material, and we've reviewed about 120 of them so far over the last 7 years, mostly the carbon-based ones, it's very important for us to see how it's manufactured, how it will be used, the structure, the size, and the size distribution. The use is really important because of the exposure considerations, because of the concerns for many of the nanoscale materials. So when we review nanoscale materials, there are certain things that are very important for us. One is the proper characterization of the material being reviewed by EPA. And the second is looking at published data that's available in the literature. And I'm going to have a drumbeat today on characterization. This is a hugely important thing. Well, it's very important to have more data, toxicity data on nanoscale materials. I think that's obvious to everyone. Environmental fake data, that's obvious to everyone. But what's really key is characterizing the material so that we know what we're reviewing and the ability to compare it to materials that have been studied in the literature. And, you know, we often, for these materials, what's very important for us because of the inhalation concerns is, are there any 90-day inhalation studies that are out there? And so our ability to use it really has to do with how well the material that was the subject of a 90-day inhalation study was characterized, so we can determine how similar it is to the material that we are reviewing. And I can't tell you, just taking a minute on the proper characterization, how limited the characterization has been of many of the materials that we've received notifications on, and how often we have gone back and asked people to recharacterize it, because without that, we can't make the finding we need to make, and they can't commercialize it. It's just, I think, a significant issue from a regulatory perspective for us. So there's not a lot of data on these. I think, you know, there's more data being generated in the literature. Some of it is limited because of the characterization issues, but we will generally take a conservative approach, and we will treat these as respirable, poorly soluble particulates. And so this is one of our categories that we use when we're reviewing new chemicals. The focus of this is inhalation concerns, effects on the lungs. So this will really drive to a large extent the regulatory management of the chemical. So then what happens? For almost all of these, not all of them, we have limitations on the manufacturing, import, processing, use, distribution, and commerce. And what we do is we will basically say, unless you provide us data that indicates that one of these is not a concern, we need to impose these limitations. First thing that we look at is the use of the nanoscale material. For example, we had one use, material was respirable certainly, and the proposed use was spray application in a consumer use. You know, the red flags, of course, went up with that. And so without data showing that this was not an issue, we actually asked for a lot of upfront data. They decided to withdraw this use for the chemical. The other thing we do is we're trying to minimize exposure. Given the lack of data, we will require that workers have personal protective equipment, respirators, gloves, impervious gloves, other PPE. As a general matter, we will limit releases to the environment, given the lack of information on impacts. The other thing that we will do is we often will limit the use to that identified in the submission. So they'll come in with a particular use. What we'll basically say, fine, it'll be part of the agreement. If there's a different use that you want for this material, you need to come in to EPA, and we would review it in a similar manner. The other thing that we usually do is, as part of the agreement, once they exceed a certain production volume, we will require testing depending on the nanoscale material. The most frequent test that we require is a 90-day inhalation study. And this is something that we typically require when we see respirable, poorly soluble particles. So, hopefully I've given you a little bit of a background on how we review these and how we treat the nanoscale materials. And I just want to talk about a little bit about better information that would help us develop a more targeted assessment. Because, basically it's a lot of personal protective equipment, limitations on the uses, and no releases. So we would love more data, human health and environmental toxicity data, and environmental fate data, of course. But I think that's obvious to everyone on the need for better data. And I'd like to touch on a few other things that from a regulatory perspective would be really helpful for us in the United States in assessing these. Identification of nanoscale materials is not critical, but I wanted I'll briefly touch on it. The other things are the physicochemical characterization. As I said earlier, this is just hugely important, so we know what we're looking at and we're able to compare it with what's in the literature. Better data on exposure assessment for humans and the environment, particularly end of life for consumer products, and toxicity testing guidelines. So just very briefly, there's no standardized nomenclature. There's general terminology for science and technology for describing these things. In the short term, it's not a huge issue. We've only seen 120 of these that we have to classify. But for the longer term, as we see more and more standardized descriptions that are not cumbersome would be helpful. And people are working on this. Again, and I told you guys I was going to really beat the horse on the characterization of the nanomaterials. And I think there are a number of issues associated with this. Is because it's so critical, we need it for identifying the materials, and I think there are a number of reasons why this is so problematic. And I think it's widely viewed as problematic within the OECD. Mario may remember we were bugging the ISO people on standardization techniques and identifying the appropriate techniques for subcategories of nanoscale materials, because we're just not quite there yet, and I think work needs to be done on that. And just again, continue beating my horse, there was a review, there's been a review in the US looking at the literature, and I've been talking to some folks in Europe who've also been doing a review of the literature, and they think only about 50% of the studies have materials that are decently characterized. And so what that means is that 50% of the studies are of extremely limited use out there for anyone to really understand what was actually studied and how that can be compared to other things. Part of it, I think, is that the researchers often don't realize how important characterization is. Part of it is the lack of standards, and we're all working on improving the standards. And part of it is the not knowing what subcategories that the standards will apply to. So I know many of you guys are researchers, so this is all my plea to you in terms of characterization, so that we can do a better job in making our regulatory decisions. I think I've already touched on this. The other thing that's quite important, and I think we do a better job with minimizing exposure to workers, but it's looking at the life cycle of the materials. There's work that's being done right now. EPA and others are partnering with ILSI on the Nano Release Project, and it's looking at multiwalled CNTs and polymers and the fate of those polymers and how much of the CNTs are coming out. And so right now that's at the stage where folks are trying to identify what polymers will actually be studied. In the U.S., the National Institute of Standards and Technology is also doing an assessment of life cycle. So this will help make us make better decisions in terms of some of the uses. The other thing that was mentioned earlier, and I think over the last couple of days, is toxicity testing guidelines. And I think folks, at least within the OECD, the pronouncement is that most guidelines are generally applicable to the testing of nanoscale materials. I think that though folks believe that the toxicity testing guidelines, looking at environmental fate, that those can be improved to make them much more applicable for nanoscale materials. And so we're working on that over the next year or so to modify them. And again, as I mentioned, we're also working with ISO to focus standards so that they are more applicable to subcategories, metals, metal oxides, CNTs of nanoscale materials. So, in summary, to be able to make more tailored regulatory determinations, we need better data. Now, I realize that the paradigm we have in the United States is different than the paradigm in Europe, but there are a lot of products from Europe and other parts of the world to come to the U.S. And for us to do a more tailored assessment, we need better characterization. We need standards that are specific to individual types of nanoscale materials. And where we lack data, it makes it more difficult for us to, getting back here, to make this determination that by law we're required to make, that the manufacturing, import, processing, and use and disposal of the chemical may not present an unreasonable risk. And so with more data, we may be able to make a less conservative determination, or maybe it would result in a more conservative determination. But thank you. I appreciate your time and listening to this perspective from EPA in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this very comprehensive overview of the TSCA. I take also the liberty now to have the first question, actually, because I see you may need to take a more conservative approach in the absence of data. This is also what Federal Institute for Risk Assessment in Germany is thinking of. And what would be the conservative approach? Is it more kind of a imposing of a nano to bulk extrapolation factor, or what does this conservative word mean?
Oh, to be even more conservative than we are, since we don't allow any releases and no exposure to workers. It may be that we would limit even more uses than we do limit. I mean, I want to underline that we support the technology. We're not trying to impede the technology, but we really want to minimize exposures. And so, while it hasn't been comprehensive, we haven't done it that many times. There are certain uses that that are really problematic, like consumer spray application.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you. Your presentation is wonderful, and I appreciate it. The question I have is really sort of on the lines of the more conservative approach, but just catching one piece in one of your slides, you said that products may be approved and then the same materials may appear again. From a legislative point of view, is this going to have any sort of precedent? Is it going to say, well, if we used it once and it wasn't so bad and we have some data? Or will it be a strictly contextual decision that the new context is so potentially different that it's as if one never applied with the same substance before. And I think this is something that's going to have enormous ramifications down the road as more products appear with multiple applications from the same substances. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Our determination in terms of whether it may not present an unreasonable risk is very specific, or can be. It's not for all chemicals that way, but can be very specific for that type of use. And so what we do is we enter a consent agreement, a negotiated consent agreement. So that limits the manufacturer importer, and then we go through rulemaking to apply that more broadly to anyone else who would want to use the chemical if they want to in a different way. Oh, I sign a lot of them. Yes.
I'm sorry, I know what this means, but I think for other people it's very important that they understand a consent decree is not just hello, how are you, and you sign a letter. This is an extraordinarily expensive and complex process, and in some ways prohibitively expensive for some small enterprises perhaps. Is there another way besides consent decrees? I mean, that's a very detailed and expensive route.
Well, I think usually, let me step back. Usually with a lot of people who come in under TSCA and the new chemicals program, we do a pre-submission meeting with them to see what we can work out up front before they come in to minimize any of these issues. But once we do a consent degree, I mean, it's negotiated with them, so they know, what's required, and they've become pretty standard for them. But it's basically something that the representative from the company signs and I sign, so it doesn't go beyond that.
And maybe I would like to intervene as well, maybe to the Vision 2020 for the United States. Do you have any clues on that? So you are on the exposure side, maybe exposure limitation. We heard from Dr. Robert Landsiedel that we might have the biological effects trigger for more conservative approaches in regulation. So there seems to be a kind of a diversity.
Well, I think in terms of if I understand the question, for the rest of the universe that we look at, where we have regulations under development, I think we're going to a similar approach as the 2020 approach. It's, yes, on that. On this, it's just we really do need to make this really specific determination that if they're going to make it, it can't have an unreasonable risk. But I think that, as we get more, it's really tied to the amount of data and the quality of the data. And if there's better data, maybe all the time we, instead of requiring respirators and no releases to the environment, that could be changed and limited. So we could allow some releases to the environment of some of the materials. And actually, to be fair, there are some things that we do see that we don't put these controls on because it won't be respirable. Like if there's CNTs being grown out of a cadmium selenide disc and the disc is big enough, you don't have a respirable concern, and so that you won't have these controls. So it really is a case-by-case analysis of the specifics of the case.
And I would like to join. is that you point out, and I think it's of course a problem both in the US and in Europe, the thing about consumer exposure, that's just not something we can sort of sit on the hands and wait. There needs to be some action taken, and I think I very much welcome what you, in my terminology, what you do is that you actually push risk management in front of risk assessment by saying that use restrictions is a way to go, to act now. Okay, maybe you're wrong, but then you were a bit more protective. And I think that's something that we could learn a bit from in Europe, where we perhaps always want to build it up, and then take a very informed decision, but that will also come many years down the road. So I really see that. I was actually writing here since when have the US started using the precautionary principle? I thought it was banned over there, but it seems to be some kind of precautionary action, actually. So I welcome that. Then I had another question about this, that you don't have this new definition, or there's nothing that is new as a new substance. But it also has the other side that old then becomes quite broad. Old in the sense, I was thinking about silver and just wrote down the statement that silver is toxic, silver is, we have seen, accumulative, and it's not degradable. So silver is old and bad. So do we need more data for taking a regulatory decision?
Yes, and I think you bring up a really good point. For a small part of the universe, we do put the risk management more up front.
I know it's not the total thing.
Right.
Yeah.
For a large part of the universe where we're developing regulations for the metals, like silver, the metal oxides, there are no regulations in place. And so the approach that we need to take is that we're going down the path is more like a European approach, getting the information, doing the assessment, and that's what the regulations look to do is gather more information to assess these. I agree. Oh, the Friends of the, okay, yes. But like I said, right now we're regulating just one part of the universe on, for nano scale materials. And the approach that I was talking about is really specific, doesn't include pesticides. And Friends of the Earth had, yes, sued EPA on its decision, its high-Q decision on nano silver. And because we're in the middle of the lawsuit, I can't really say too much about that.
With this, I think we have to close the session and say thanks a lot for coming.